Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when powdered wigs ruled polite society, when your head was less about thoughts and more about presentation. Picture it. Candlelight flickers across a vast ballroom, soft harpsichord music floats in the air, and every nobleman in sight is sweating under a puffed-up white monstrosity on his scalp. This isn't a costume party, this is Tuesday, and your hair. It's not your hair, it's horsehair, or goat, or maybe even someone else's cast-off. All of it baked in starch and regret. You think you've made bad fashion choices. Georgian, England is out here spraying their heads with flour. Yes, actual flowers, a symbol of wealth and sophistication. Not because it looked good, spoiler, it didn't, but because it said, I am so rich, I can dedicate an entire room in my house just to making myself look like a haunted cake. You probably won't survive this level of powdered ridiculous. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments, love, seeing where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The powdered wig, known more formally as a peruke or periwig, was less a fashion statement and more a declaration of status and desperation. It all began in the 17th century, when King Louis XIII of France started going bald at an alarming rate. Not one to let hair loss mess with his royal image, he commissioned a full wig. His courtiers followed suit because, well, flattery is a form of job security. By the 18th century, particularly in Georgian England, the powdered wig had become a deeply entrenched cultural artifact. You, as a fashionable aristocrat, wouldn't dream of stepping out without your head cloaked in layers of hair, powder, and pretense. The powder itself was typically made from finely milled starch, often wheat, or potato-based, and sometimes scented with lavender, orange, or even cinnamon to mask the underlying scent of rot and mildew. Because yes, those wigs weren't washed, ever. Now, let's pause and consider. You're spraying edible starch onto dead animal hair that sits on your unwashed scalp for hours, maybe days, at a time. Under candlelight, it might have looked ethereal. Under daylight, you probably resembled a dusty scarecrow with delusions of nobility. The powder wasn't there just for appearances, though. Supposedly, it made the wig look cleaner and more elegant. White was associated with refinement, wisdom, and maturity, qualities you definitely needed to fake if your real personality was just gambling debts and powdered cheeks. And yet, here's the kicker. The starch used in wig powder was also a staple food item, so, while the poor were struggling to find bread, the rich were literally tossing flour onto their heads. Historians still argue whether the extent of this flour-wasting fashion truly contributed to food shortages, or whether that's just retroactive class critique, but either way, it's not a great look. But it gets stranger. Some of the wig powders weren't just white. In fact, certain elites chose pastel tones, blues, pinks, even lilacs. If you had extra flair, or too much time, you could match your wig powder to your outfit. It was less style and more live-action cartoon, but it certainly turned heads and sneezes. Because powdered wigs weren't hypoallergenic, there are plenty of diaries that mention guests coughing and wheezing through balls, not because of the pollen, but because they were practically being fumigated in clouds of airborne starch. Then there were the less pleasant additives. To give the powder a more adhesive texture, some recipes called for ground bone, plaster of Paris, or even lead-based whitening agents. So yes, it wasn't just annoying, it was genuinely harmful. You're not just itchy, you're slowly poisoning yourself. But hey, at least you're the best-dressed ghost in the ballroom. And who applied all this powder? Well, you didn't. That job went to your valet, or a specialist known as a hairdresser, though their job was more like a cross between a pastry chef and a chimney sweep. You'd sit down in a special robe, a long one, to shield your clothes from the deluge of powder, and they'd brush your wig out, adjust its curls, then dump a fine layer of powder over it using bellows or large puffers. The powder settled not just on your wig, but also your face, your collar, and despite the robe your entire being. You didn't leave the powder room so much as escape it, like a ghost emerging from a flour mill. Powdered wigs also had their own social etiquette. You wouldn't wear the same wig to every occasion, just like you wouldn't wear sneakers to a black tie gala. There were casual wigs, riding wigs, courtroom wigs, military wigs, and even mourning wigs powdered black, of course, because grief, but make it fashion. And, as usual, imitation trickled down. Middle-class merchants and professionals who couldn't afford full wigs might sport toupes or hairpieces, still powdered but often poorly maintained. Their powder was more likely to clump, discolor, or smell faintly of despair. But for a few glorious seconds in the mirror, they could feel like they belonged to the powdered elite. Even clergymen got in on the trend, though usually with simpler styles. A good wig conferred a sense of dignity, a moral authority made somehow more believable by resembling a sentient cauliflower. Still, historians debate whether the average wearer genuinely liked the style or just tolerated it to avoid looking outdated. Because yes, trends are peer pressure wearing a fashionable hat. Some letters suggest that people found the wigs uncomfortable, itchy, and absurd, but endured them anyway. Others defended the fashion, claiming it kept the head warm in drafty castles and was worth every sneeze. But you know the truth now, don't you? This was never really about fashion. It was about conformity, spectacle, and the illusion of control. Powdered wigs were the 18th century version of filters and fillers, trying to sculpt an identity out of artifice. So, the next time you worry about what you're wearing to dinner, take comfort. At least your outfit doesn't require a funnel, a sack of starch, and a servant with a powder gun. You sit stiffly in a high-backed chair, the scent of lavender-scented starch still clinging to your nostrils. But beneath all the grandeur and powdered glory of your Georgian wig, something is wrong. Not visibly wrong, no. From the outside you're a vision of powdered perfection, but underneath, your scalp is staging a rebellion. A hot, itchy, suffocating rebellion. This is the part they don't tell you about, the itch beneath the elegance. See. Once that heavily powdered wig is strapped onto your head, you're trapped. It's not a loose, casual thing you can just fluff and remove mid-soiree. These wigs are tied down tight, sometimes even stitched into braids of your own hair, or pinned so firmly that adjusting them would require a wrench, or a team of footmen. And if you've powdered it just right, you certainly don't want to disturb the artistry with something as indecent as movement. So there you are, locked in a sort of high society helmet. Beneath the wig, your scalp begins to sweat almost immediately. Georgian wigs were rarely ventilated because no one had invented the concept of airflow for the head. You're basically baking your skull in a dome of thick hair, starch, and the occasional dash of crushed lavender or orris root. The scent is lovely, but the feeling, imagine putting your head inside a stuffy bread oven, then adding a sprinkle of sand just for fun. And here's where the real trouble starts. That sweat has nowhere to go. Trapped under layers of hair and powder, it begins to irritate your skin. Your scalp itches furiously, but scratching is socially unacceptable. You can't just reach up during dinner and give your head a good scrub knot unless you want to send a puff of powder onto your soup. So, you endure. You smile through the discomfort. You nod at conversation you can barely hear over the rustling of your own powdered curls, and all the while, your scalp simmers. It's not just the powder, it's the wig itself. Wigs were typically made from horsehair, yak hair, goat hair, or in some cases, human hair. None of these were treated with modern hygiene standards. Lice were a constant threat, and if you weren't diligent, your beautiful status symbol could become a teeming micro-ecosystem. The smarter nobles, well, let's say the luckier ones, had special wig stands. At night, they'd remove their wig and let it rest on a mannequin head, airing out and hopefully drying before the next day's rituals. Others weren't so lucky. Whether from laziness, lack of help, or sheer aristocratic stubbornness, some people slept in their wigs, that's right, 8 hours a night, face down in starch and goat hair, only to wake up with half the curls flattened and the scent of decay a little stronger. There are documented reports of scalp infections, fungal, bacterial, and everything in between caused by poor wig hygiene. Redness, blistering, even scabbing. But you couldn't stop wearing the thing just because it was hurting you. That would be like leaving your social rank at home. Historians still argue whether these scalp horrors were widespread or more of an upper-class exaggeration, but the evidence suggests that people were often quietly suffering beneath their powdered elegance. Personal letters from the era mention unbearable itching, boiling discomfort, and the shame of scratching like a common dog. One courtier even wrote of having to excuse himself from an audience with the king due to a violent sensation beneath the fringe, which, if we're being honest, sounds like something you'd hear in a dermatology clinic. not a royal chamber. And let's talk about the weather. Summer in London or Paris could be miserable. Humid, muggy, filled with the aroma of horse dung and too many humans crammed into narrow streets. In that kind of heat, wearing a powdered wig felt like strapping a wool sock to your head and hoping for the best. The powder clumped, the curls wilted, and your face turned a blotchy shade of pink beneath the effort of simply existing. But removing the wig wasn't an option, not unless you were in private, among friends or servants. And even then, there was a specific ritual to it. You couldn't just yank it off like a baseball cap. No, you had to unpin, unlace, and often use a bit of oil to release the powdered hair from your own. Otherwise, the sweat and starch acted like glue, bonding your skin to the undernetting of the wig. And once the wig was off, well, your own hair underneath likely wasn't in great shape. Constant compression, poor air circulation, and weeks without a proper wash meant your scalp looked like something out of a medical illustration. Dry patches, oozing sores, hair loss, dandruff the size of postage stamps. One observer even described seeing flakes as large as a florin fall from a gentleman's crown as he removed his wig at a tavern. So romantic. And let's not forget the lice. Oh yes, the dreaded lice. Wigs didn't repel them. If anything, they attracted them. Think about it. Warm, dark, full of crevices, rarely cleaned. The average Georgian wig was a 5-star hotel for parasites. So much so that some wealthier folks developed a charming habit of keeping 2 or 3 wigs in rotation, not for fashion, but so they could quarantine one while wearing another. A few even resorted to dusting their wigs with mercury or vinegar in hopes of warding off the lice. That worked about as well as you'd expect mild chemical burns and a light salad dressing scent. And yet, this was the height of elegance. At parties, you'd nod across the candlelit hall at someone who was, without question, suffering just as much as you were. Their smile would be strained, their eyes glassy from heat, their hand twitching ever so slightly toward their scalp before they caught themselves. It was a quiet suffering, a collective one, an agreement that to be fashionable was to be uncomfortable, possibly infested, definitely sweating. But the show must go on. Some folks tried to adapt. A few inventive souls added wire supports inside their wigs for ventilation. Others began trimming their wigs shorter to reduce heat, leading to the popularity of styles like the clubbed or bobbed wig. But even then, the powder remained. The starch, the ever-present, gently suffocating film that coated not just your hair, but your thoughts. By the end of a long day, your head felt heavy, your skin raw. You'd remove the wig and gasp not dramatically, but with quiet relief, like stepping out of a sauna you never asked to enter. Your hair underneath would be matted, damp, and desperately clinging to what dignity remained. You'd sit there in your dressing gown, powder falling in soft clouds onto the vanity table, and think, tomorrow, I'll do it all again. And you would, because to be wigless was to be exposed. To let the world see your real hair thinning, greasy, maybe even bald was to risk mockery, judgment, and worse, social invisibility. Better to endure the itch than to vanish. So you scratched, silently, endlessly, elegantly. You're back in the powder room again. This time, there's a different scent in the air, something floral, yes, but also sharp, almost metallic. The lavender is still there, faintly soothing, but there's another note underneath it that makes your nose twitch. It's not just starch in your wig powder tonight. No, today's blend is extra refined, and by refined, we mean mildly toxic. Welcome to the strange and unsettling cocktail that was Georgian wig powder, a mixture of beauty, deception, and very questionable science. Let's get one thing straight. It wasn't just flour. The basic ingredients, yes, often wheat or potato starch, was just the beginning. Fashion, as always, demands variety. And variety, in this era, meant experimenting with additives that would make a modern chemist clutch their pearls. In your powdered arsenal, you might find chalk, gypsum, even ground bone. Some blends used kaolin clay, a fine white powder used in porcelain, prized for its smoothness and shine. But others took a darker turn. You've probably heard rumors of lead-in makeup during the 18th century. But what about wigs? Oh yes, lead acetate sometimes found its way into wig powder, either to enhance whiteness or to add a heavier, more clingy texture so the powder would stick better to coarse animal hair. It worked. It also caused skin irritation, neurological symptoms, and, over time, that delightful Georgian death glow. And then there was arsenic. Not always, of course. You wouldn't find arsenic in every powdered head, but it did appear from time to time, particularly in fringe recipes passed between wig makers, alchemists, and apothecaries who believed it could enhance whiteness, deter lice, or simply add a bit of mystique. Historians still argue whether these arsenic-laced concoctions were widespread or limited to eccentric fashionistas and shady Bakali barbers. But there's enough circumstantial evidence, letters, diaries, and even medical records that suggest arsenic in your wig wasn't entirely outlandish. You might think, surely they knew better, but 18th century toxicology was still in its infancy. People didn't understand cumulative poisoning the way we do today. You might experience headaches, fatigue, or hair loss and simply blame it on the weather or bad humors. There are accounts of courtiers fainting mid-dance or becoming increasingly confused and pale over time, chalked up to stress or melancholy when in reality, their beloved beauty rituals were slowly dismantling their health. Of course, many powdered wigs also contained fragrance. This wasn't just for elegance, it was a full-on defense strategy. In a time before reliable sanitation, powdered wigs helped mask the less pleasant aromas of daily life. You're walking through a city filled with chamber pots, horse droppings, and people who believe bathing once a week is excessive. A little orange blossom or rosewater powder. It's practically survival. But again, perfume technology wasn't exactly standardized. Some powders were infused with orris ruta substance, derived from the iris flower, which had a sweet violet-like aroma. Orris was prized in wig powders but required years of aging before it was safe to use. Impatient vendors often skipped this step, leading to batches that caused rashes or worse. Other perfumes were alcohol-based and flammable. So, if you happened to get too close to a candelabra at a party, well, there's a reason some hairstyles were called explosive fashion. Let's not forget the impact on the wig makers themselves. The artisans who prepared and applied this powder weren't just styling your hair, they were handling these substances daily, breathing them in, getting them on their skin, and absorbing them over time. Many developed chronic respiratory issues, skin ulcers, or even blindness. One notorious recipe included a powdered blend of white lead camphor and vinegar, allegedly for maximum shine. That same blend was later linked to multiple cases of hand tremors and hallucinations in young apprentices. This was a world where aesthetics and poison blurred freely. Think about it. You're sitting in a wooden chair, eyes closed, while a man with powdered hands and a flickering candle gets ready to dust your head with a concoction made partly of root vegetables and partly of murder. And yet, no one questioned it, not seriously, because if the Duke of Bedford used it and the Duchess of Devonshire swore by it, then surely you could trust it too. Fashion was its own science, and social proof often mattered more than real evidence. There's a kind of shared madness to it all. Everyone powdered, everyone smiled, and everyone quietly ignored the persistent nosebleeds. There were alternative recipes, of course. Some health-conscious wig users, or at least those prone to hypochondria, turned to cornstarch or rice flour, mixed with rosewater or citrus peel. These blends were gentler on the skin, but didn't always offer the same elegant finish. Your curls might look flat or greasy, and in a world where first impressions were everything, that simply wouldn't do. In some regions, especially outside the main fashion hubs of London and Paris, people developed local adaptations. Italian noblemen sometimes used volcanic ash or finely sifted marble dust. In the Caribbean colonies, colonists experimented with talc and chalk, sometimes mixing them with rum-soaked herbs. None of these regional blends were particularly safe, but they did demonstrate just how far people would go to maintain appearances. A powdered wig wasn't just a wig, it was a passport to respectability. And yet, even as you sit in front of the mirror, blinking the dust from your lashes and sneezing softly into a scented handkerchief, you know this can't last forever. Something in the back of your mind is beginning to whisper, this isn't normal. You've noticed your headaches have become more frequent. Your barber says your scalp is thinning in patches. Your friends, once as powdered and pristine as you, are beginning to look a little off color, but no one wants to admit it, because doing so would mean acknowledging that the very thing you've spent years perfecting, the ritual, the expense, the endless afternoons in the powder room, isn't just ridiculous. It's dangerous, so you double down. You ask your wig dresser to try a new blend, next time one with a hint of clove. Maybe it'll feel better. maybe it won't. But what matters is that, once again, you'll walk into the ballroom looking immaculate. You'll glide past flickering candles and gossiping aristocrats, your powdered curls catching the light just so. And underneath it all, your scalp will itch, your nose will twitch, your lungs will quietly protest, but your reputation, untarnished, spotless. Perfect. It's morning, and you're preparing for yet another day in powdered high society. You shuffle groggily toward your powder parliers, an entire room devoted to the act of making your head resemble a lightly frosted confection. You're not alone in this absurdity. Nearly every respectable aristocrat or aspiring professional has carved out a space in their home to accommodate the chaos that is Georgian hair maintenance. And why? Because appearances are everything, and today, you're expected to look like a ghost who's moonlighting as a courtier. The powder parlor is a curious place, equal parts dressing room, chemistry lab, and battlefield. It's where wigs go to be reborn and where your ego is carefully fluffed into social acceptability. The room is usually small, windowless, and covered in layers of fine dust. No matter how often it's swept, powder clings to everything: drapes, carpets, wigs, lungs. It's like living inside a powdered donut. Your hairdresser, the unsung hero of the powdered class, is already there, sleeves rolled, powder bellows in hand. They greet you with the air of someone about to perform minor surgery. You sit on a wooden stool, tuck a linen cloth around your shoulders, and brace yourself. First, the wig is brushed carefully, reverently, each curl reshaped, each knot teased loose with a small ivory comb. The hair is already brittle from yesterday's powder and whatever creative chemicals your stylist cooked up last night. You hear it crackle softly with static as the bristles pull through. It's not soothing, it's ceremonial, like preparing an offering to the gods of vanity. Then comes the main event, the powdering. A large wooden bellows, filled with your signature blend of starch and scent, is pressed gently against your wig. With a soft humph, a puff of powder explodes over your head. You feel it settle on your shoulders, your eyelashes, even the tip of your tongue. It tastes like damp chalk and despair. Your stylist steps back to examine the coverage, then nods. Another puff, then another. Soon the room resembles a bakery mid-frenzy, and your head is the cake. This whole process might take an hour. On special occasions, you sip lukewarm tea through gritted teeth, trying not to inhale too deeply. Sometimes you sneeze in embarrassment your stylist tactfully ignores. Other times, you simply close your eyes and float through the haze, dreaming of breezes and clean scalps. This is not a pampering ritual, it's work. And not just for you. The role of the hairdresser, also called a perruquier, was serious business. These were skilled artisans who trained for years to master wig maintenance, curling irons, scented powders, and face powder blending. A talented hairdresser could command enormous fees and gain access to powerful social circles. In fact, some were so influential they acted as informal gossip merchants, learning secrets while fluffing curls, passing tidbits between duchesses. Like powdered diplomats. And powder parlors weren't confined to private homes. In cities like London and Paris, entire public powder shops emerged, salons where men and women of all ranks could have their wigs fluffed, scented, and styled for a fee. It was common for gentlemen on their way to court to stop in, have their periwig freshened, and maybe pick up the latest political rumor while they waited. For the working classes, it was often a shared service. You and a neighbor might split the cost, arriving early in the morning for your appointment and hoping the bellows weren't too clogged. In these bustling establishments, etiquette reigned. You'd wait your turn, seated on a bench, holding your wig carefully on your lap. Powder drifted through the air, invisible clouds. Some patrons wore powder masks, delicate mesh screens that protected their eyes and nose while their wigs were treated. Others just suffered through it, blinking furiously and coughing as they emerged. Blinking and powdered like ghosts, freshly risen from the earth. And make no mistake, there was a hierarchy to powder the upper crust could afford. Powder, created by mixing starch with ground violet petals, cloves, even small amounts of ambergris. Yes, the famously expensive substance, sourced from whale intestines. These perfumed blends were costly and rare, so if you entered a ballroom smelling faintly of cinnamon and luxury whale goo, everyone knew you were someone. But if you were lower on the social ladder, your powder options were simpler. Coarse, flour, old starch, maybe a drop of vinegar to cut the scent. The texture was rougher, the color uneven. If you couldn't afford regular powdering sessions, your wig would start to yellow, the curls collapsing into limp spirals. In the glittering halls of the elite, a drooping wig was the ultimate humiliation. You might as well arrive barefoot. In fact, powder itself became a social litmus test. Too much, you're trying too hard. Too little, you're slipping. The right amount, just barely noticeable. Powder was not meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. Like a presence, like a whisper. It was there to suggest wealth, not scream it. And then there were the powder puffers. Specially designed gadgets made of silver or brass that dispensed powder in a fine mist. Some were elaborate contraptions, passed down as family heirlooms. Others were homemade, assembled from bellows and cloth, wheezing with every pump. These tools became symbols of vanity and domestic ritual. It wasn't unusual for a family to keep one on the mantelpiece, right next to the Bible and the snuff box. Once your wig was properly powdered, your servants sprang into action. Clothes brushed, buttons fastened, your shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and your cravat arranged just so. The powder, though seemingly weightless, added a certain heft to your presence. You moved carefully, avoiding sudden gestures that might disturb the delicate balance of your powdered dome. You bowed with precision. You sipped your tea from the side. You stood like a statue of grace and starch. But don't let the elegance fool youth. This was also a display of power. Powder wasn't just a fashion, it was a performance. It said, I have time to waste. I have servants. I have a room in my house solely for dusting dead hair with glorified flour. It was aristocracy. In aerosol form, historians still argue whether powder parlors were primarily a symbol of luxury or a necessity born from impractical fashion. Some argued that the powdered wig simply required that much upkeep. Others suggest that the entire culture around parlors, the stylists, the bellows, and perfumes was deliberately constructed to gatekeep elegance. If only the wealthy could afford the maintenance, only they could define beauty. But there's another, more personal truth. The powder parlor was also a ritual of reassurance. It was a space where you could transform. Whatever the world thought of you weak, aging, balding, you could sit down in that chair and emerge powerful, immaculate, powdered. Even if underneath your scalp was a battlefield, you're stepping out now, your wig, freshly powdered, your curls sculpted into symmetrical perfection, and your dignity resting heavily atop your head like a trophy. But today isn't just any stroll through the gardens or an idle promenade. Today, you're off to the heart of political theatre, where powdered wigs aren't optional, they're practically a uniform. Welcome to Parliament, where decisions about war, taxes, and imperial conquest are made by men who all look like they've been dusted for fingerprints. You walk through the echoing stone halls, past marble busts and oil paintings of men who wore even bigger wigs than yours, and into the chamber where law meets pageantry. And the first thing you notice, besides the low murmuring of debate and the faint scent of stale ink and candle waxes, that everyone's wig is immaculate. This isn't fashion anymore. This is credibility on your head. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, powdered wigs had become more than just a vanity item for the aristocracy. In legal and governmental circles, they became institutionalized. Attire, judges, barristers, and members of parliament wore them not for beauty, but for symbolism. The wig was meant to convey impartiality, wisdom, and a certain stoic distance from the common folk. After all, who could take you seriously if you looked like a mere mortal? So there you sit, elbow on a polished desk, quill in hand, adjusting your cravat and pretending not to notice that the man beside you is sneezing powder into his notes. The longer you stay, the more absurd it all begins to feel. It's a room full of grown men in ruffled shirts and powdered wigs, passionately arguing over tariffs while looking like disgruntled cupcakes. But this wasn't mere absurdity, it was a kind of political theatre, and everyone played their part. The bigger the wig, the more senior the role. Full-bottomed wigs, massive, cascading styles that practically draped over the shoulders, were worn by judges and senior statesmen. These weren't just accessories, they were badges of office. You wouldn't dare enter the House of Lords wearing a modest bobbed periwig unless you wanted to be mistaken for a clerk. The tradition of wearing wigs in courtrooms and political arenas began in earnest during the reign of Charles II, who brought the French fashion craze to England after his exile. He loved wigs partly for their elegance, partly to hide his own thinning hair. Once he reintroduced them, the trend exploded. Lawyers and officials, always eager to emulate royalty, adopted the look with religious fervor, and unlike some fleeting fads, this one stuck. Wigs became associated with professionalism and decorum, particularly in legal contexts. Even today, British barristers and judges continue the tradition, donning powdered horsehair wigs in court to signal continuity, respect for history, and separation from personal identity. Your own personality, preferences, or even hair color, irrelevant. The wig made you a vessel for justice. A powdered, scratchy, lightly scented vessel. Historians still debate the psychological impact of this tradition. Some argue that wigs served to suppress individual ego in favor of institutional authority. Others suggest they allowed men to project a sense of commanding presence even when they were physically unimposing. There's something undeniably theatrical about it, a way to step into a role, like slipping on a costume in a play. The courtroom becomes a stage, the trial a drama, and the wig your cue to perform. Yet, as you lean back and watch the proceedings, you also become acutely aware of the ridiculous practicalities. One man stands to speak, and his wig shifts slightly, sideways, giving him the look of a confused sheepdog. Another rises, gestures too dramatically, and sends a small puff of powder into the air, which floats down onto the notes of the man next to him, who sighs audibly. It's hard to maintain the illusion of nobility when you're blinking away starch and trying not to sneeze mid-argument. Still, decorum must be maintained. The care and upkeep of parliamentary wigs was no small task. In fact, many legal professionals had 2 or 3 wigs, one for daily use, one for ceremonial functions, and one spare in case of damage, or heaven forbid lice infestation. These wigs weren't cheap. A good quality horsehair peruke could cost as much as a month's salary, and maintaining it, powder, brushing, minor repairs, was an ongoing expense. There were even specialists in the legal world, known as wig makers to the bench, who dealt exclusively in courtroom hair. Their reputation was sacred. A crooked curl or uneven powder job could cost someone their professional dignity or worse, their promotion. And while the powdered wigs of the court and parliament were supposed to be solemn, there was always room for subtle rebellion. Some younger members of parliament began experimenting with different powder blends, aiding faint tints of lilac or silver to stand out, while still technically adhering to tradition. It was the 18th century version of wearing colorful socks with a grey suit, but even within this powdered order, class distinctions remained razor-sharp. The wealthier officials had longer, more elaborate wigs. Clerks and scribes wore smaller, plainer versions. You could tell someone's rank, their connections, and even their education, just by the curl pattern on their wig. Tight vertical curls meant high status. Looser, irregular curls, probably a provincial lawyer from the countryside. Then there's the awkward fact that many of these wigs were made of human hair, not donated, mind you, but purchased, often from the very poor. Women and even children sold their hair to wig makers in exchange for a few coins, especially in times of famine or hardship. So, while the elites debated import taxes or sentencing laws, their dignity was literally perched atop strands clipped from a starving girl in the slums. It's powdered irony at its finest. As the years went on, the fashion began to fray around the edges. Enlightenment thinkers scoffed at the theatricality of wigs. Revolutionary ideologies across Europe pushed back against aristocratic Nothing screamed aristocrat quite like a puffed-up white hairpiece. During the French Revolution, wigs were abandoned almost overnight, seen as the ultimate emblem of elitism. In England, though, the legal world clung on, insisting that the wig wasn't fashion, it was tradition. And that's the thing about tradition. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be followed. So there you are, in your seat at Parliament, pen scratching across parchment, as another man stands to give an impassioned speech about reform, taxes, or maybe even wigs themselves. The chamber is silent, except for the occasional wheeze of an old man's powdered breath, or the soft rustle of cravats being adjusted. You wonder if anyone else is as uncomfortable as you are, if their scalp is itching, if their wig feels like it's slowly squeezing the thoughts from their brain. But no one says a word. They never do, because this is respectability, powdered and perched for all to see. You're young, you're healthy, and your hairline is miraculously intact. But if you're living in 18th century London, none of that matters. Because if you want to be taken seriously in court, on the dance floor, or even at brunch, you're going to powder your wig white and try your best to look like a distinguished 60-year-old with chronic gout. That's right. The the hottest trend among the Georgian youth wasn't rebellion or innovation, it was premature elder cosplay. So you stand in front of your looking glass, a teenager in the prime of life, while your valet applies layer after layer of powder to your perfectly good, thick, brown wig. It's made from horsehair, and it smells like something between a barn and a bakery. The starch clings to every coil, giving you the aura of a man who's read far too many Greek philosophers, and probably owned several harpsichords. But this is more than vanity, it's social strategy. In a world obsessed with respectability, powdered wigs become a fast track to perceived wisdom. The white hair, historically a sign of age, and therefore knowledge, suddenly becomes a shortcut for the under 30 elite too. Fake gravitas. It's like buying fake glasses to look intellectual, except you're also inhaling flour every time you move. Historians still argue whether this was rooted more in admiration for the aristocracy's aging heads or simple insecurity among rising middle-class men desperate to project authority. What's certain is that by the mid-1700s, you weren't taken seriously unless your head looked like it had been dunked in a sack of chalk and then tacked by a wind machine. This was especially true for law students, clerks, and young professionals eager to rise through the class ranks. A dusty, white powdered wig could be the difference between just another hopeful and future barrister. You might be sleeping in a rented room above a noisy alehouse, but on the streets, you'd look like you owned land and wrote sonnets on the weekends. Naturally, this obsession filtered into universities. Students at Oxford and Cambridge often adopted powdered wigs even before earning their first degree. Lecture halls began to resemble aging salons, full of puffy white domes bobbing behind inkwells. Professors already in their 60s probably looked on in confusion as 90-year-olds tried to outpowder them. And let's not forget the influence of the monarchy. King George III, with his stately powdered wig and stern gaze, became the aspirational model for many young men. To emulate him was to participate in an idealized version of English stability. Whether or not you could afford a tailor, a fine cravat, or a proper education, the powdered wig gave you a crown of sorts, a fragile, dusty halo of ambition. Of course, maintaining this illusion required a small personal staff or a lot of patience. Each morning, your valet had to comb, restarch, and recurl your wig. Powder came in delicate sachets, usually a blend of rice flour, arrowroot, or cornstarch. For flair, you might request a hint of lavender, orris root, or bergamot oil. And if you were truly pretentious, you'd get the blue tint, a special powder that turned your wig a soft grey blue, hinting at a certain poetic melancholy. But even among powdered youth, there were levels. The truly wealthy never wore the same wig 2 days in a row. They had entire wardrobes of wigs, morning wigs, walking wigs, formal wigs, riding wigs, and casual Sunday wigs, which were just as heavy, but maybe a tad less tall. Some even had wigs fitted with internal wire structures that lifted the curls into dramatic peaks, so that from the back you looked like a tiered wedding cake on stilts. You, of course, can barely afford one good wig, so you wear it until it itches, until it wilts, until it starts to smell like wet parchment. Still, that layer of powder, flaky, pristine, and impossibly white, transforms you into someone new, someone older, someone who maybe once met Voltaire. Yet there's a certain sadness to it all, isn't there? A generation of fresh faces, smothering their youth in dusty disguise just to be taken seriously. You sometimes catch your reflection and wonder what your own hair might look like under all that fluff, but then you remember the stakes. Without the powder, you're just you, hopeful, unsure, unimpressive. With it, you are the very image of societal promise. The irony: the older generation, the ones with actual white hair, begin turning away from the trend. By the late 18th century, there's a quiet rebellion among aging nobles who begin wearing their natural hair, cropped and powdered just lightly. They call it en toilette de chasseur, hunting toilet, supposedly rustic, supposedly masculine, but really, they're just tired. Tired of the flower storms, tired of the scalp rash, tired of carrying half a bakery on their heads. So while you're out there in your 20s, wheezing under a wig like a frosted soufflé, the man you're trying to impress is quietly dusting off his own natural curls and muttering, "Enough, you'll follow eventually." Everyone does. But not yet. First, you've got a court hearing to attend, and they expect powdered wisdom, not youthful honesty. So you pick up your comb, brush out the stray clumps, and inhale deeply flour, perfume, and just a hint of anxiety. One last puff from the valet's puff box, one final squint into the mirror, and out you go, another young man disguised as a relic. By now, the powdered wig has become more than just fashion. It's a uniform, a language, a ritual. You no longer question the routine, the daily brushing, the precise puffing, the slight tilt of your head so the powder doesn't settle into your eyebrows too heavily. You've learned to cough quietly when the valet overdoes it, and to hold your breath when walking into rooms where half a dozen powdered heads turn at once. The air in those places hangs thick with starch and quiet desperation, but something is changing. You don't notice it at first, because change, when it creeps, often comes softly whispering through salons and corridors before it shouts on the streets. But in whispers, it begins. The idea that perhaps less is more. Perhaps youth should not be buried under a layer of aging dust. Perhaps dignity can be worn naturally, without artifice, without the weight of centuries resting on your scalp. At first you dismiss it. It feels like a threat to everything you've invested in, every hour spent perfecting your curls, every coin spent on scented powder, every compliment received at dinner parties about your fine bearing or dignified appearance. And yet, when you pass by the new breed of men, those radical, clean-cut, fresh-faced types, you feel something tug at you, a curiosity, maybe even a longing. They don't wear wigs. They wear their own haircut, short, oiled, and parted neatly. Their collars are higher, their coats less adorned, their expressions quietly smug. They're part of something new, a wave, a movement, even. It's French at first, of course. All things fashionable tend to be. Paris starts it, and the whispers drift across the channel like smoke. At first, it's only the philosophers and artist sorts who are always on the edge of scandal anyway. Rousseau, with his naturalism and his wild talk of society corrupting man. The poets, too, speaking of returning to simplicity, to truth. They cut off their wigs and call it honesty. They denounce powder as vanity, as deception. You scoff, but part of you is listening. And then the revolution happens. France descends into chaos, and suddenly the powdered wig is not just unfashionable, it's dangerous. To appear aristocratic, to look too proper, too powdered, is to flirt with the guillotine. In Paris, barbers begin offering not wigs but cropped haircuts styled à la victime, mimicking the look of someone ready for execution. It sounds absurd, but it catches on. You read about it in the papers. You hear travelers whisper it in London's coffee houses, and slowly, it seeps in. At first, the English elite are horrified. We are not the French, they insist. We do not discard tradition for anarchy. But fashion has never cared much for borders. Soon, a few daring young men in London begin showing up at soirees without wigs. There's shock, there's gossip, but also admiration. They look unburdened. Their heads seem lighter, their posture more relaxed. They breathe easier. The powdered crowd begins to split. Some cling to the ritual, powdering more fervently than ever, as if to prove a point. Others start scaling back. The powder becomes finer, the curls looser, the colors more muted, off-white, pearl gray, even soft taupe. These are not full rejections, just hesitations. But hesitation is enough. It signals a shift. You feel it in yourself too. You begin skipping powder on some mornings, just on quiet days, when you know you won't be seen by anyone important. You let your valet rebrush the wig but keep the powder box closed. You tell yourself it's just for comfort, but the truth is, you want to see what your real hair looks like again. You haven't in years. The first time you go entirely it's terrifying. You feel exposed, like a performer stepping onto stage without makeup. You worry people will notice, that they'll judge. But strangely, no one says a word. A few glance at you longer than usual, but not in ridicule. There's curiosity in their eyes, maybe even respect, and then it accelerates. By the late 1790s, Parliament debates whether to require wigs in court. Judges begin abandoning them in private. Younger barristers argue they can project dignity without looking like marble statues. The old guard grumbles, but their voices sound tired, powdery, like their wigs. Barbers pivot fast. Wigs were once their bread and butter, but now they offer haircuts in the tightest style, short, Roman, and vaguely heroic. They advertise clean scalps, oiled combs, and the joy of feeling wind on your actual hair. Wigs gather dust not on heads, but on shelves. Even women begin to follow suit. No longer do they pile their hair 3 feet high. powdered like pastry towers. Now they wear it simple, classical, inspired by Grecian statues. A sort of fashionable humility. They call it revolutionary beauty. You see it at balls, where once the air was thick with flower and perfume, and now it smells faintly of citrus and soap. You keep your wig in a drawer now. You haven't powdered in weeks. Your valet looks relieved. He trims your natural hair with care, oils it, and combs it to one side. When you walk into a room, heads still turn, but this time, it's for your boldness, your clarity. You didn't expect to like it, but you do. You feel younger, lighter, honest, and you're not alone. The country shifts quietly, then suddenly, in 1795, the British government, desperate for funds during the war with France, imposes a tax on hair powder, a guinea per year. It doesn't sound like much, but it's symbolic. The powdered wig is now officially a taxable luxury, a relic. People revolt in silence. They stop paying. They stop powdering. They stop pretending. By 1800, most men except judges, bishops, and the hopelessly nostalgic have shed their wigs entirely. It happens so fast that it feels like waking from a dream. One day, you were a dusty monument to tradition. The next, you're just yourself, and for the first time, that feels like enough. The wig still sits in your drawer. You haven't thrown it away. You don't hate it. It served its purpose once, but its time is over now. When you walk the cobbled streets, you no longer leave a trail of powder behind you. You leave something quieter, truth, perhaps, or maybe just the gentle rustle of your own hair in the breeze. And isn't that strange? How something once essential can vanish almost overnight and take with it not just a style, but an entire way of being. You wake up one morning in 1795 and find yourself standing in front of your wardrobe, not in search of clothes, but dreading the cost of a powder cone. Yes, a cone, a wrapped, pressed, dusty bundle of wheat starch, perhaps with a bit of violet essence if you're lucky. Your wig, once the pride of your social climbing self, sits limp and beige on a mannequin head, waiting to be fluffed, powdered, and perched atop your already sweaty scalp. But today, something's different. There's a ripple in the powdered waters of the Georgian elite. You've just learned the government has announced a tax on wig powder. Yes, the powder tax, possibly the most hilariously inconvenient government cash grab in history. It sounds silly now, but at the time, it was scandalous. A yearly tax of 1 guinea, about the cost of a week's wages for many, was suddenly required if you wanted to legally douse your skull hat in powder. The government had noticed that vanity was lucrative, and they wanted in. You couldn't just shake on a bit of starch and call it a day anymore. Now you needed a license, literally, a receipt. And get this, your name was recorded in a government ledger, marking you forever as someone who opted in to powdered vanity. You trudge into the local tax office to pay. The clerk doesn't even look up from his ink-stained ledger as he asks if your powder is for personal display or professional necessity. Apparently, judges, clergy, and military officers were exempt. That's right, if you were holding a Bible, a sword, or legal documents, you could stay dusty for free. But the moment you powdered your wig just to strut through Hyde Park, it became taxable. The backlash, as you might expect, was chalky and furious. Powdered protests broke out in salons, boudoirs, and gentlemen's clubs. One satirical cartoon depicted a nobleman emptying his pockets, dust flying everywhere, while King George grinned and swept it into a coin purse. The aristocracy, who previously puffed themselves with pride, now faced a dilemma: either pay up and wear the powdered look with a sort of dusty shame, or abandon it entirely. Many chose the latter. The powder tax, while intended to raise funds for Britain's war with France, ironically helped kill off the very fashion it targeted. Wig makers reported plummeting orders. Powder dealers, yet there were people whose entire job was to sell this stuff, began to shutter their shops. The term guinea pig even took on a sarcastic twist in some circles, referring to those who still paid the guinea to keep up appearances. You didn't want to be one of those people, did you? Even more fascinating is how the tax quietly mirrored the shifting social landscape. Across the Channel, France was guillotining its powdered class into irrelevance. Powdered wigs were seen as foppish, wasteful, and completely out of touch with the populist sentiments rising across Europe. England, always eager to pretend it wasn't watching the French too closely, still took the hint. Powdered wigs were beginning to represent something far more dangerous than poor taste. They hinted at aristocracy, privilege, and old systems that people were growing weary of. But don't think everyone gave up their powder overnight. Some clung stubbornly to the trend, even as they were mocked in ballads and caricatures. There was even a wave of powderless pride among the younger generation, who proudly wore their natural hair or shaved heads as a silent rebellion. The powderless were fresher, freer, and let's be honest, probably less itchy. It didn't take long before the term bigwig, originally meant to praise authority, began to sound more like an insult. Historians still argue whether the powder tax alone was the final death knell of wig culture, or if it merely sped up a decline already well underway. Some claim the tax was more symbolic than practical. Another way the government could remind the elite that nothing, not even their vanity, was sacred. Others insist it was a financial nail in the coffin, forcing even the proudest lords to dust off their shoulders and move on. Regardless, the tax office kept meticulous records. To this day, historians have unearthed those ledgers, listing names of once proud powder patrons. It's a bizarre little who's who of 18th century fluff addicts. And the irony, many of the people still paying the tax by 1800 were older, set in their ways, too rich or too stubborn to change, which meant that wig powder, once a symbol of youth, virility, and upward mobility, slowly transformed into something else, a marker of age and irrelevance. Imagine it. The very thing you once wore to look impressive now made you seem out of date, like showing up to a TikTok shoot with a flip phone. You picture yourself 10 years from now, sitting in an old armchair, your wig flattened and stained, your powder cone crumbling in the drawer. A younger cousin walks by, his hair tied back casually, his face clean, his scalp free. He smirks slightly, doesn't even need to say anything. You feel it. The era has passed, and all you have to show for it is a government receipt and a yellowing newspaper clipping about the powder tax. The story could end there, with powdered wigs simply fading away under the pressure of taxes and social change. But the powder tax, like most poorly conceived fiscal experiments, lingered on the books until 1869. That's right, long after powdered wigs had left public fashion. The tax still technically existed. For over 70 years, a legal remnant of starchy vanity haunted the British budget like a forgotten flower ghost. Now, as you lie back and reflect, you imagine all those elegant Georgian halls, once filled with clouds of lavender-scented dust, now quiet, the powder boxes closed, the cones unsold, the once proud bigwigs quietly putting away their pomposity, not with a bang, but with a final sneeze. You're sitting in the back room of a once busy London wigmaker's shop, its shelves half bare, its windows clouded with dust, not from powder, but from disuse. The calendar on the wall reads 1798, and, while the city outside buzzes with change, inside these walls time seems frozen. You glance around, mannequins with drooping curls, tins of unused powder crusted shut, and long-forgotten tools once wielded like instruments of high fashion. The silence is thick, like the air in a ballroom after the last guest has left. The wigmaker, once a bustling artisan, now little more than a ghost, in his own shop sits, hunched at the counter, adjusting a powdered queue on a mannequin out of sheer habit. He barely looks up as you enter. He doesn't need to. He knows why you're here, and he knows it's not to buy anything. I used to take 20 orders a week, he mumbles, brushing non-existent dust from the hem of a faded wig. Now I'm lucky if I get one in a month. And it's always some crusty old baronet who still thinks he's dining with Pitt the Younger. You ask him when it all changed. He sighs, long and slow. Wasn't just the powder tax, that was just the hammer. No, it started long before, with the young folks, the poets, the soldiers back from France with cropped hair and stories of guillotines, the women with wild curls instead of structured coiffures. They looked alive, not sculpted. He gestures toward the corner of the room, where a once glorious perruquier's Avena contraption designed to dry wigs into perfect curls now sits unplugged, its brass gears tarnished. No one wants perfection anymore, he says. They want motion. They want real. You begin to understand powdered wigs weren't just a fashion, they were a performance. They required time, space, effort. You didn't just put on a wig, you powdered it, fluffed it, styled it, you posed in it. It was a costume for a part no one was casting for anymore. And suddenly, nobody wanted to play the role of important person number one in a Georgian drama. They wanted to be someone fresh, someone modern. The wig maker stands. Finally, and leads you to the back. You pass rows of curled ponytails and embroidered caps, each tagged with the name of some noble house: Pembroke, Cavendish, Cholmondeley. They never came back to collect them, he murmurs, too embarrassed maybe, or too dead. You reach a small, locked cabinet. He opens it with a key worn smooth from years of use. Inside lies a row of powder cones, perfectly preserved in waxed paper, labeled with dates and ingredients. One reads, Violet Starch, 1794. Another, Potato Starch Blend, unscented. Each cone is a relic of a world that no longer exists, echo of powdered elegance packed into a neat, triangular prism. He hands you one. It feels delicate, like holding pressed snow. Go on, he says. Crack it open, for the smell. You do. A faint aroma drifts up, floral, dry, oddly medicinal, not unpleasant. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you hear the echo of a harpsichord, feel the swish of brocade skirts, see the flicker of candlelight on gold-trimmed mirrors, a room filled with whispers, powdered heads turning in unison, fans fluttering, like moth wings. But when you open your eyes again, all you see is a dim room and the tired face of a man who once dressed dukes for court. I kept these, he says, because I thought the fashion might come back. Everything comes back, doesn't it? He laughs bitterly. Except this. Outside, you notice a barber shop newly opened across the street, large windows, clean chairs, posters of men with slicked back hair, and no sign of powder. Inside, a boy with sideburns and confidence you can't teach is getting a trim. His hair is natural, free, alive. You think of how much simpler it is to just wash your own hair and go. No starch, no perfuming, no tax dot yet. Part of you aches for the drama of it all. The wig maker walks you to the door. As you step out, he calls after you. You know the worst part. It wasn't losing the money, it was the silence. He taps the side of his head. There used to be talk. Men would sit in here and argue about Mozart, Parliament, Voltaire. They had ideas. Now they just get their hair cut and leave. You don't know what to say. But later that night, lying in bed, you realize something. Powdered wigs weren't just about vanity. They were social armor. They transformed you. They gave the ordinary man the bearing of a prince, and the prince a place among gods. And the powder was a veil, a blurring of age, class, even reality. When you powdered your wig, you weren't just dressing up, you were crossing a threshold into something theatrical, ephemeral, and entirely ridiculous, but also beautiful. And then you remember something strange. Even as powdered wigs vanished from the heads of men, they didn't vanish from the world entirely. No, they migrated. Across the Channel, the French courts had long abandoned them, but in Britain, their ghosts survived. In courtrooms, judges and barristers continued to wear powdered wigs long after they'd died in the ballroom. Why? Because, in court, appearances mattered, rituals mattered. The wig became not a symbol of fashion, but of authority, of tradition, of impersonality, a reminder that behind the wig, the person didn't matter, the law did. And here's the twist. In some parts of the UK, that tradition still endures, even today. So while you might not see powdered wigs on the promenade or at tea, they linger in marble halls and oak-panelled courtrooms, silent, stiff, and stubborn as ever, because some ghosts never leave. And powder, well, you can still buy it, just not in a cone. The courtroom is cold, always cold, not from poor heating, but from something else, something architectural. The stone walls, the high windows, the wood polished to a dark gleam, and the silence you could slice with a gavel. You sit at the back of the room, hushed like everyone else, watching a man in a black robe and white horsehair wig adjust his papers. The air carries no scent of starch, or violet powder is no longer applied. But the wig is still there, and in this room, that matters. It's the 21st century. And yet, in England and Wales, courtroom wigs remain a living fossil, a curious relic of powdered tradition, surviving in a world of email, smartphones, and LED lighting. You watch the barrister rise, his robe swinging, his voice crispant for a moment. You wonder, why is this still happening? To understand that, you need to go back, way back. The courtroom wig wasn't born in a courtroom. It was born in the drawing rooms and salons of the 17th century, amid powdered cheeks, perfumes, and fanning flirtations. As wigs became fashionable among the elite, they seeped into professional life. Doctors, professors, clergymen, yes, Lawyers adopted them not just for style, but for status. Wearing a wig said, "I belong to a certain class. I am part of a tradition. I speak with authority." But by the early 1800s, powdered wigs in daily life had become anachronistic, too fussy, too expensive, too artificial. The world was changing, and wigs couldn't keep up. Yet even as they disappeared from salons and boudoirs, they stayed rooted in the courtroom. Why? Because the courtroom wasn't about change. It was about continuity. You learn that, in law, appearance is more than visual, it's symbolic. The wig doesn't just conceal the barrister's hair, it conceals the individual. It turns the person into a function, a channel for the law itself. The moment the wig is donned, the barrister becomes not just a man or woman, but an advocate, a voice of procedure, precedent, and impartiality. You are not arguing as yourself, you are speaking on behalf of the system. And there's something else, something deeply British. The wig is a ritual. And in Britain, rituals matter. Even now, in a country that's digitized nearly every corner of life, the courtroom remains a place apart. You bow when entering. You stand when the judge arrives. You refer to people as my lord, my lady, or your honor. It's not theater, it's legal choreography. And the wig is part of the costume, yes, but more than that, it's a piece of armor. Speak to barristers and you'll hear it again and again. When I wear the wig, I feel different. Some say it helps them leave behind the stress or chaos of their personal lives. Others say it offers a sense of equality, leveling the field between rich and poor, junior and senior. Everyone looks absurd in a wig, and that's oddly democratic. And yet others confess that the wig lends them courage, a kind of borrowed authority, like slipping into a uniform before heading into battle. You find an old legal shop tucked away in London, one of the few still selling hand-tied wigs. The shelves are lined with white curls and ceremonial robes. You pick one up. It's heavier than you expect, but soft, two made from horsehair, not human. Each wig takes weeks to make, knotted by hand with precision passed down through generations. A clerk in a pinstripe suit explains, "These are the full-bottom wigs, worn by senior judges on ceremonial occasions. Barristers wear the short ones, bench wigs, and no, they're not powdered anymore, just bleached." You ask who's still buying them. New barristers, he says, with a shrug. And the old ones, replacing their worn ones. We don't sell as many now, of course. Some courts don't require them anymore. And that's true. The rules have shifted. In 2007, England and Wales officially ended the requirement for wigs in most civil and family court proceedings. The logic was clear. Wigs were intimidating, outdated, and added an unnecessary layer of formality. In cases involving children or vulnerable adults, they could make things worse. But in criminal courts, they remain, because in criminal trials, where the stakes are highest, the tradition is thought to reinforce dignity, authority, and gravity. Still, not everyone agrees. Some critics argue that wigs are arcane, classist signals that alienate the public and elevate legal professionals into a kind of elite priesthood. Others say they're absurd, a form of historical cosplay incompatible with modern justice. But those who defend the wigs point out that law is not just about function, it's about form. And form communicates trust, seriousness, and distance. From Chaos. One barrister tells you, "I've worn the wig for 20 years. And let me tell you, when I stand in front of a jury, that wig isn't a joke. It's a signal. It tells them, this is serious. This isn't reality TV. This is a trial." And there's something strangely comforting in that. In a world constantly shifting where institutions are questioned, authority is under siege, and tradition is often discarded, there's a strange dignity in holding on to something, even if it's just a white horsehair wig. So the powdered wig lives on, not in the perfume-scented parlors of Georgian society, but in the solemn spaces of British law. It no longer carries the scent of violet starch or the sparkle of mica dust, but it carries meaning. A kind of theatrical sobriety, a reminder that justice, like powder, works best when applied evenly. And with care, you leave the courtroom that afternoon in silence, and on the steps outside, you notice something almost imperceptible. The barrister you saw earlier is now out of his robe, out of his wig, sipping coffee on the street like any ordinary man. His hair is thinning, his coat is cheap. No one notices him, but in that courtroom, he was something else. He was the law. And you understand now why powdered wigs haven't truly vanished. Because some roles, once taken, are hard to abandon. And some costumes, no matter how outdated, still hold power, even in silence, even in starchless strands, even today. You are seated in a grand portrait gallery. One of those long, echoing rooms lined with brocade wallpaper and oversized oil paintings of people who look like they smelled of rosewater, stale tobacco, and moral superiority. Their eyes follow you. Their powdered curls shimmer under the chandelier's glow, though the powder in the paintings doesn't flake. It never does. You take slow steps along the polished floor, passing duchesses in embroidered silks and dukes, with satin sashes and military medals they probably never earned. Every one of them is powdered, thick white dust crusts, their wigs like a pastry under frost. You look closely and realize it wasn't fashion, it was a message, one as calculated and coded as the crests on their rings. Powder was not a garnish, it was propaganda in the heyday of powdered wigs. The British aristocracy understood something vital. They weren't just born into power, they had to perform it. The grandeur wasn't accidental. The pearls, the fans, the gilded carriages, the powdered periwigs, they were costumes in an ongoing theatre of status, and the audience everyone else. You sit in the velvet chair beneath a portrait of Queen Charlotte. Her wig is colossal, almost absurdly so. Dozens of ringlets cascade, like icing down either side of her head. The powder is thick, unmoving, and perfectly pale. But you know what that powder's hiding, don't you? Lice, scabs, grease, dandruff, maybe even sores from hours of wearing horsehair against delicate skin. Because despite the nobility's obsession with presentation, hygiene was another story entirely. Many of the powdered wigs you see in portraits were, in life, rarely cleaned. To do so would loosen the structure. The powder clung to everything: wig, scalp, collar, shoulders, and the longer it stayed, the more it became part of the wearer's identity. You learn that some aristocrats, particularly in the late 1700s, would simply apply fresh powder over the old layers, a kind of social sedimentation, and the result, the wigs became monuments to their own decay. A powdered wig could carry weeks' worth of dust, sweat, and old perfume. The starch would harden into clumps, attract insects, or cause allergic rashes. Yet this very fragility, the difficulty of maintaining the look, was the point. Only the rich could afford to look that impractical. The powder itself wasn't cheap either. High-quality powder made of finely ground starch, often scented with orris root, ambergris, or crushed lavender, was manufactured by apothecaries in carefully guarded recipes. The finest batches were featherlight and snow-pure, floating through the air like moon dust. Lesser powders, sold to clerks and shopkeepers, were heavier, sometimes yellowish, often gritty, and the finest of all, that went straight to the palace. You're surprised to learn that royal households maintained their own powder rooms not for the residents, but for their staff. Footmen and pages were expected to be powdered before appearing in public service. They wore wigs too, usually smaller than their masters, but still curled, powdered, and pinned. Imagine it. A servant wakes at dawn, shaves his head clean, fits on his assigned wig, and stands in a narrow closet while another man beats a powder puff against his skull. The air is thick with starch and sweat. He sneezes, his eyes water. But the powder must go on, because to appear unpowdered in the royal court was more than indecent, it was offensive. You begin to see how wig powder became a form of silent policing. The aristocracy didn't just define itself by wealth or title. It defined itself through daily rituals of appearance. Powder was one of the most visible, most theatrical, and most wasteful of them. You turn to another painting, this one of a young lord in blue satin with a peacock feather tucked into his wig. His cheeks are pinked. His expression is cool, detached, almost bored. But you know the routine behind that image. He would have spent hours with his valet wig brushed, pinned, and dusted, then carefully dressed, powdered again, perfumed, gloved, jeweled, all to appear effortless, because effort, in aristocratic logic, was vulgar. The goal was to float above the world, not labor in it. And when this performance began to crumble in the late 1700s, it didn't go quietly. The French Revolution rattled every powdered skull in England. Overnight, appearance became dangerous. To look aristocratic was to invite suspicion. Even in Britain, where the monarchy survived, the fashion of powdered wigs began to decline. But decline isn't the same as disappearance. No, not yet. Instead, the powdered wig morphed into something else, something stranger. You read about the dandified men of the Regency era, figures like Beau Brummel who rejected powder in favor of natural hair, neatly cut, and trousers over breeches. But here's the twist. Even as fashion moved on, the aristocracy clung to its powdered ghosts. At royal events, powdered wigs were still required for ceremonial staff. In state portraits, some lords continued to wear powdered periwigs, even into the early 1800s, stubborn symbols of the old world. Why? Because powder meant pedigree. It whispered of a time before revolutions, before commoners in parliament, before trade became more powerful than title. You exit the gallery now, stepping into the bright light of the present, but you carry with you a strange realization. Wig powder was the aristocracy's final illusion, a substance that allowed them to mask mortality with glamour, to disguise bodily decay with ceremony, to flake apart, slowly, with dignity. And perhaps it was poetic, in a bleak kind of way, that the powder eventually came to symbolize their decline. By the end of the 1800s, powdered wigs were worn only at court functions, royal weddings, and old paintings gathering dust. Yet in those tiny white particles, sifted, scented, and sprinkled, you glimpse an entire world crumbling in slow motion, a world obsessed with surface, with staging, with looking like something that no longer existed. And so the next time you see a portrait of a powdered noble, don't just admire the elegance, squint, look closer. Imagine the itch beneath the powder, the stale perfume clinging to lace, the silence of servants brushing dandruff off shoulders, the vanity of a dying class captured in chalk-white curls. Because that powder, that wasn't just flour, it was fear. By now, you've gotten used to the absurdity of the Georgian world, haven't you? Wigs that resembled pastries, powders made of dubious materials, and a society that prided itself on layering artifice over reality like fondant over stale cake. But tonight, we stumble into something a bit more volatile. The moment powdered wigs nearly ignited public unrest. It's not just a powdered scandal, it's a full-blown powdered panic. Let's set the scene. The year is 1795. Britain is in conflict with revolutionary France. Bread prices are soaring, taxes are climbing. The average Londoner is feeling the squeeze, not just in their corset but in their coin purse. And then just when people thought powdered nonsense couldn't get more ridiculous, the government proposes a powder tax. Yes, a tax on wig powder. It sounds like satire, but it's real. The British Parliament, in a financial bind and needing to fund war efforts, thought it would be clever to squeeze money from the one thing Georgian elites couldn't live without, their beloved starch-based crown of vanity. The Hair Powder Act of 1795 required wig wearers to purchase an annual certificate, 1 guinea per head, for the right to powder their coiffures. At first, this seemed like a reasonable enough scheme. After all, only the wealthy still powdered their wigs regularly. But the backlash was immediate and deliciously chaotic. You might imagine the upper crust taking the tax in powdered stride. But instead, many quietly rebelled. They abandoned powder altogether. The look of the moment shifted overnight. Suddenly, natural hair was fashionably oiled and brushed back in a defiant rejection of starch and duty. Cropheads, as they were nicknamed, strutted through London with smug grins and zero powder residue. But here's the twist. The backlash wasn't only about fashion or taxes. It was political. To where your hair naturally became a symbol of anti-establishment sentiment. And those who kept wearing powdered wigs, they were mocked as loyalist relics. Aristocratic fossils, old fogies clinging to the powdered past. Political cartoonists sharpened their quills and had a field day. One famous satirical print showed a snooty, powdered lord being dunked in a vat of starch by a mob of servants shouting, "Pay your guinea or go bare." The tension spilled into the streets. There are scattered records of verbal fights and near riots at public events. One notorious incident unfolded at a London theatre in 1796, when a powdered MP arrived and was heckled mercilessly by the audience. They threw scraps of bread, mocking the idea of taxing powder while people starved. The MP stormed out. His wig, however, did not reportedly snatched off by a rowdy lad and paraded through the stalls like a trophy. It's funny, but it wasn't. Just a joke to the people living it. In many ways, the wig powder tax became a symbol of everything wrong with Georgian society. A bloated upper class, deaf to the struggles of the poor, so obsessed with their image that even their vanity was monetized. Historians still argue whether this powdered panic marked the true death knell of wig culture in Britain, or whether it was just the final straw in an already crumbling tower of fluff and flour. Even the clergy got tangled up in the mess. High-ranking bishops who had worn powdered wigs as part of their formal dress began to abandon them out of embarrassment. Sermons became less about divine wisdom and more about dodging snickers from younger members of the congregation. It was hard to preach eternal truth while looking like you'd just fought off a powdered donut. What's particularly telling is how fast the shift happened. Just a few years prior, powdered wigs were a sign of decorum, civility, and status, but within a decade of the tax, they were comedic relics. Fashion turned its back with cold finality. It was like watching a social media influencer lose all their followers overnight, one day admired, the next irrelevant and meme-worthy. Some upper-class families tried to maintain the tradition behind closed doors. They'd host powder parties, complete with secret wig dressers, hidden powdering rooms, and whispered apologies. But even these gatherings fizzled out. The starchy white clouds just didn't carry the same glamour anymore. Powder had become the punchline. Even more interesting, the tax didn't even raise that much money. It turns out only about 46,000 people ever paid for the certificate. Compare that to the population of millions and the massive expenses of war, and it's barely a drop in the powdered bucket. Parliament's plan had flopped, though they did keep the tax technically active until 1869, long after wigs had vanished from everyday fashion. That's the irony, isn't it? Georgian society had poured so much effort into building an aesthetic empire on powder and wigs, only for a poorly thought-out tax to topple the whole thing. And underneath all that collapse was something remarkably human. Resistance not with torches and barricades, but with hairstyles, with brushstrokes, with quiet acts of defiance of simply walking into a ballroom with your real hair scandalously visible to all. So as you lie here tonight, picture that odd moment in time, a city where powder meant politics, where a hair choice could get you laughed out of Parliament, and where even your scalp had to pick a side. And imagine, just for a moment, being the poor wig maker who had spent his whole life perfecting the art of puffed starch domes, now watching as clients cancelled appointments and shaved their heads. Talk about an occupational hazard. As you drift deeper into this powdered labyrinth of Georgian history, you begin to realize something that might have eluded the casual observer. Wigs, despite their apparent absurdity, weren't just fashion statements or social signals. They were ideological battlegrounds, silent declarations of power, identity, and, more often than not, gender. That's right. Beneath all the starch and lavender and flower dust, wigs quietly contributed to the shaping and policing of masculinity and femininity in 18th century society. Let's start with the most visible divide, the public versus the private. For men, wigs were armor, part of the uniform. You didn't step into court, or a salon, or even a respectable coffee house, without that powdered mane perched atop your head. It was the symbol of control, cleanliness, class, but more than anything, it was a gendered assertion of who got to speak, who got to rule, who got to be taken seriously. A shaved head crowned with a towering wig suggested discipline, a taming of the natural self, in favor of something orderly, artificial, and public. Women, on the other hand, faced a different set of rules. Their wigs and, later, their elaborate hairpieces weren't tied to profession or respectability in quite the same way. Instead, they were tethered to ideals of beauty, fertility, desirability. The higher the hair, the closer to marriage. The more powdered and ornate, the more likely one was to appear in a gossip sheet or painted onto a fan. Where men's wigs were about function and authority, women's were about spectacle. But of course, the divide wasn't always that simple. Because here's where things get messy. Wigs blurred lines as much as they enforced them. Take the fashion-forward salons of Paris, for instance. In the late 1770s and 80s, women's hairstyles became so dramatic, so architectural, that they began mimicking male wigs, not in shape, necessarily, but in power. Marie Antoinette herself turned her hair into a stage. She wore ships in her coiffure, literal ships, entire political messages encoded into strands of powdered hair. Her most famous look, the coiffure La Belle Poule, which included a replica warship balanced among ostrich feathers. It wasn't just fashion, it was satire, it was defiance, It was power. Men, meanwhile, began flirting with softness. The powdered wig, once a marker of brutal legalism and stern politics, became lighter, curled more delicately, paired with lace cravats and silken breeches. The line between masculine and feminine aesthetics began to shimmer and flicker in candlelight. One could argue that the late 18th century was one of the most androgynous periods in upper-class male fashion history. The ideal Georgian gentleman powdered his face, painted his lips, and spent as much time on his toilette as any duchess. It was a society where masculinity was defined not by ruggedness, but by poise. Still, the gender politics of wigs were hardly neutral. If a man took his wig off in public, it was a statement, possibly radical, maybe indecent. If a woman did so, it was scandalous, unthinkable. Hair, for women, was still entangled with morality and virtue. That natural femininity needed to be controlled, bound up, styled, framed within acceptable parameters. A man's unpowdered scalp could be considered fashionable in post-Axe Britain. A woman's unadorned hair, that could ruin her. The regulation of hair also trickled into religious life. Clergy, both Protestant and Catholic, adopted wigs, not just for uniformity, but for moral separation. A powdered wig made one above the natural, animal state. The same thinking applied to judges. That ridiculous horsehair wig was meant to separate the man from the man's emotions, to turn him into the role he played, impartial, logical, removed. And so, powdered wigs didn't just express gender, they performed it. Each morning, as you sat at your dressing table, you were constructing an identity, powdered, brushed, tied, with black ribbon, scented with orris root. And that performance came with stakes. A wig too effeminate might draw whispers. A hairstyle too ambitious might threaten authority. Too simple, you might seem poor. Too lavish, you might seem vain. Every curl said something. Every dusting of powder was a sentence in a silent conversation between you and society. And when you think about it, isn't that what fashion always is? But wigs made it explicit. Possible and unavoidable. A whole generation grew up knowing that. You were depended, quite literally, on what you wore on your head. There's also the curious phenomenon of cross-gender parody in powdered culture. Theatres, particularly in London, loved mocking both the puffed-up masculinity of powdered men and the towering absurdity of women's coiffures. Male actors wore grotesquely large wigs to parody lawyers or dukes. Female impersonators, especially in the burgeoning world of underground theatre, used wigs as camp tools, as satire, as weapons. The wig became both mask and mockery. It could elevate you or destroy you, depending on how it was worn. Now imagine the servants, the ones who had to manage all of this. The anonymous wig dressers, almost always male, who entered women's boudoirs in the morning like quiet artists preparing a canvas. The young boys apprenticed to barbers and surgeons, learning not just to curl hair, but to interpret the shifting winds of fashion. They saw it, all the insecurities, the ambitions, the arguments over whether lavender or ambergris was in style that week. To them, wigs weren't just about gender or status. They were a trade, an economy, and yet, even they weren't immune to the pressures of appearance. There were strict rules, especially in wealthy homes, about how footmen and pages could wear their hair. It had to be powdered, had to be tied properly. No one was free from the powdered expectations. And then came the revolution, the French one. Suddenly, powdered wigs were seen not just as old-fashioned, but dangerous. In France, aristocrats were mocked, beaten, and worse for their appearance. Wigs became a death sentence in some parts of Paris. To be well-dressed was to be guilty. To wear a towering wig was to invite the guillotine's whisper. And so, wigs began to vanish, not because they fell out of fashion, but because they became political liabilities. In the years that followed, hairstyles became simpler, shorter, freer. Women let their curls breathe. Men cut their hair close to the head. Powdering dwindled, especially as it became clear that clinging to the old ways was no longer chic. It was fatal. But even as wigs disappeared, the legacy of powdered gender remained. We still see its ghosts today, on judges' benches, in ceremonial courts, in costume dramas. We still grapple with how appearance shapes perception, how hair of all things becomes a battleground for identity. The powdered wig may be dead, but its echoes linger in every gendered dress code, in every debate about what is appropriate, in every whispered expectation about how one must present oneself in polite society. So as you lay your head down tonight, think of the people centuries ago doing the same but atop pillows filled with lavender sachets, trying not to smudge their powder or disturb their carefully tied cues. Think of the roles they played, the lines they towed, the masks they wore not on their faces, but crowning their heads, and wonder, perhaps, if we're all still wearing wigs, just made of different materials. You wake up sometime around the year 1795, figuratively, of coarsened powdered wigs are gasping their final breath. But wait, don't change into your cravat just yet. Even though powdered hair is clearly fading, its ghost lingers in unexpected places, clutching at its dignity like a drunk aristocrat at the opera. The truth is, the decline wasn't neat. It wasn't like someone rang a bell and all of London's high society snapped their fingers and said, "Right then, off with the flower." Instead, what you get is a slow, awkward cultural molting. The wig doesn't vanish, it deteriorates into something that's more of a caricature than a trend. In fact, by the time you step into a late Georgian ballroom, the powdered wig has become such a desperate signal of old-fashioned elitism that even the butlers are smirking behind their trays of sherry. Fashion always dies twice. First, it dies among the forward thinkers, who quietly abandon it for something cleaner, freer, or more natural. The second death is more brutal. It's when comedy gets involved. And that's exactly what happens here. By the early 1800s, satire grabs the powdered wig and runs wild. Artists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank don't miss a beat. Their caricatures of pompous lawyers, clueless judges, and dithering lords depict hair mountains, so absurdly high you wonder whether these men are hiding pigeons or a poorly paid clerk inside them. In one popular print, a gentleman's wig is so tall it has a wick vein. That's not artistic exaggeration. Well, okay it is, but it's rooted in the truth. The taller your wig, the more you clung to outdated grandeur, and when culture starts laughing at you, it's already pulled the pin on your fashion grenade. What's fascinating is how wig to once a status symbol now becomes the very thing that dates you. In real time, younger men start to see it as ridiculous, a relic. A man in powder is not respectable anymore. He's out of step. Think of it like someone showing up to a 2025 tech startup meeting in a Bluetooth earpiece, Oakley wraparound shades, and a belt holster for their iPhone. Technically functional, yes, but socially, you've just told everyone in the room you peaked in 2008, but here's where the weird twist happens. Rather than fully disappearing, the powdered wig becomes institutionalized. It's no longer fashionable, it's ceremonial. Lawyers and judges keep wearing them, but it's no longer about beauty or power. It's about ritual, about preservation, about declaring, we've always done it this way, and we're not about to stop just because the French revolutionaries are cutting off powdered heads. You shuffle into an English courtroom, and there it is, the last safe haven of the powdered wig. Barristers and judges swish in, their robes flowing like overcooked pudding, their wigs now smaller, more manageable, and far less adorned, but still powdered, still stubborn, still holding on. Why? Historians still argue whether this persistence was about resisting change or simply about clinging to the illusion of authority. A judge in full wig and gown seems older, wiser, more detached from everyday squabbles. Remove the wig, and he might just look like someone's slightly confused uncle. There's also a psychological element. The wig becomes a way of transforming the man beneath into a symbol of law and order. And honestly, when a man has to pass judgment on another human being's life, maybe it helps to have a layer of horsehair between himself and reality. You don't just wear the law, you become it. The French, of course, wanted none of this. After the Revolution, wigs were chucked into the cultural bonfire, along with powdered aristocrats, outdated etiquette, and a few thousand actual heads. France said, enough with the starch and the frills. Liberty, equality, and very short haircuts. For all. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Britain doubles down. The powdered wig may be fading from the ballrooms and drawing rooms, but in the institutions of tradition, law, academia, even some clerical circles, it gains this fossilized dignity. The very fact that it's old becomes its defense. It's like an old dog that won't move off the couch. It's not helping, but you're too sentimental to shove it off. Quirkier still is how wig powder lives on in makeup culture. As wigs die, the idea of powdering remains, morphing into beauty rituals. The face powder you use today, translucent matte finish, oil-absorbing, is a direct descendant of those arsenic-laced Georgian powders. Okay, hopefully less deadly, but the connection remains. That cultural belief that a powdered face or head is somehow more polished, more elevated, more respectable. And just when you think it's all over, the Victorian era whispers, not quite. Queen Victoria's court flirts with powdered hair for a second or two. Not full wigs, mind you, but a certain dreamy, dusted aesthetic. Think of it as ghost powder, more of a mood than a statement. Some funeral customs even retained wig traditions. There are accounts of mourning wigs, black or grey, worn for funeral processions. You're meant to look somber, of course, but still structured, dignified, because apparently grief looks better with a properly parted center and some talc. Meanwhile, over in the theatre world, wigs never left. Powdered wigs, big ones, powdered ones, pastel ones become essential costume shorthand. If you see one on stage, you immediately know, ah, this is a pompous nobleman, probably a fool, possibly about to be stabbed in Act 3. The very absurdity of the wig tells you who this character is before they even speak. It's also a useful prop for gender confusion in Shakespearean productions. Men playing women often wore elaborate powdered wigs, helping them pass in an age where all theatre was The wig served as instant visual cues. This character is important, vain, and ritual, pretending to be Dot by the 20th century. Powdered wigs are basically extinct, outside of courtrooms, costume departments, and Halloween aisles. But their legacy, oh, it lingers. They've become a kind of historical punchline, a go-to symbol for bloated power, overwrought fashion, and people who clearly had too much free time and access to starch. And yet, there's a strange fondness to it, isn't there? Like watching footage of Victorian cyclists on those absurdly tall penny-farthing bikes. You don't want to bring it back, but you kind of admire the commitment. The powdered wig wasn't just hair, it was identity, performance, anxiety, social armor. And while it may be dead, its ghost still haunts certain corners of your modern world. So next time you see a judge in a crisp white wig or a costume drama character with curls higher than your Wi-Fi signal, you'll know. That's not just a fashion choice. That's a lingering echo of centuries of starch, sweat, satire, and silent regret. You settle a little deeper into your blanket now, as the scent of powdered starch, old candle wax, and chalky white roses still lingers in your imagination. The 18th century's strange obsession with wigs is finally beginning to feel manageable. But wait, there's still one more layer of powdered absurdity to fluff through. The decline, the powdered collapse, the slow fade from high society to dusty relic. This is where the starch begins to flake off history's shoulders. By the late 1790s, the once immovable reign of powdered wigs started to crack both figuratively and literally. You'd think a trend so elaborately maintained would go out with a bang. But no, it faded the way all tired fashions do, with a sheepish cough and someone pretending they were never that into it. It was no longer chic, it was no longer modern, and frankly, it started to feel embarrassing. The world was changing faster than ever. The biggest powder puff to the face came courtesy of the French Revolution. Ah yes, the guillotine wasn't just lopping off heads, it was slicing clean through the powdered hierarchy of old Europe. The powdered wig had become a visual symbol of the aristocracy, and in revolutionary France, that was as good as painting a bullseye on your forehead. Fashion quickly pivoted to natural hair, or even the shocking concept of no hair at all. Bald was revolutionary, if not drafty. By 1795, even the British Parliament was spooked enough to impose a tax on hair powder. Yes, a literal powdered wig tax. It was called the Hair Powder Act, and it essentially meant that anyone who still wanted to dust their scalp in the name of decorum had to pay for the privilege, about 1 guinea annually, which wasn't cheap. And what do you think happened? People stopped powdering. Surprise! Within a year, over 90% of the population abandoned the stuff, leaving just a stubborn few still caked in tradition and talc. Wigmen, once the darlings of the court and theatre alike, suddenly found themselves out of clients, out of powder, and very out of style. Many tried to pivot, some to natural hairstyling, others to theatrical costume work, but the golden age of starch and status was over. Historians still argue whether the powder tax alone was the final death knell, or whether the general shift in political sentiment against excess, against noble display, was already writing the obituary. Likely, as with most cultural shifts, it was both. There's also debate about the exact pace of decline. Some aristocrats clung to their powdered wigs well into the 1820s, but these were mostly ceremonial holdouts. The real action had moved on. You can almost picture it, can't you? Some poor viscount with a dusty white pompadour walking into a salon full of cropped, breezy haircuts, and suddenly realizing he looked like a ghost of Christmas past. The whispering behind the fans, the raised eyebrows, maybe a powdered curl fell onto someone's tea. Social death. He'd be powdered for the last time. Meanwhile, ordinary folks were embracing something that hadn't been in for generations. Authenticity, hair in its natural state, not curled, not bleached, not starched into submission, just plain, growing from your head hair. Shocking. And into this space walked a new class of tastemakers, writers, scientists, poets. The rise of Romanticism didn't just change art and literature, it changed how people wore their identity. The powdered wig, once the pinnacle of civilized appearance, now seemed fake, artificial, and out of touch. It belonged to an older, clumsier world, one where beauty was measured in how well you could hide your real self. You shift in bed again as the idea sinks in. Fashion is always about control. Control over perception, over status, over your body and how it appears to others. For the Georgians, powder was elegance. Then, in the blink of a generation, it was a punchline. How many other things are like that, you wonder? What are we currently doing that future generations will squint at and say, "Right, you guys actually did that"? There were, of course, a few stubborn institutions where powder endured. The British legal system, for one. Even today, some barristers and judges still wear powdered wigs, mostly out of tradition. But make no mistake, it's theatre now. A costume, a throwback. The same goes for certain ceremonial royal appointments. You might still glimpse powdered curls atop a Lord Chamberlain during a coronation, but it no longer signals power. It signals history, a kind of nostalgia, perhaps, or reverence for rules long obsolete. There's even a small group of reenactors and living historians, modern-day wig wearers, who go all in on the starch. The ribbon, the lead white makeup, and the everything. Not, ironically, not for Halloween, for love, for craftsmanship, for the strange, specific joy of recreating an era when your entire public identity could be contained within 12 inches of powdered curls and a good posture. But you, dear listener, you're free of all that. You don't need to powder your scalp or live in terror of sweat. You don't have to pay a guinea just to walk into society without looking uncivilized. You don't even need to worry about which side your queue hangs from or whether your wig's mesh is visible. You are blissfully, gloriously powder-free, and maybe that's the real gift of looking back at such absurd rituals. They remind us that no matter how seriously we take ourselves now, our aesthetics, our routines, our performance of what's normal, all of it is subject to the sleepy creep of change. One day, the thing you're doing right now to feel acceptable will be laughable, and the powdered wigs of tomorrow, they're already in your closet. So if you've made it this far without dozing off, congratulations. You have successfully survived Georgian wig powder. And now, with your scalp unsullied and your senses softened, it's time to let go completely. So now, you let yourself drift. The starch has settled. The perfumes have faded. The powdered wigs of the past have crumbled softly into history, and all that's left is quiet. You feel it now, that curious comfort that comes only when the world you were walking through wasn't quite real. A history of shadows and flower, of vanity and ritual, of humans trying to look more like statues than themselves. But it's over now. The ribbons are untied, the curls unpinned, the powder swept gently off the dressing table. You exhale slowly. The chamber around you, once crowded with candles and hair combs and courtly manners, empties itself into stillness. The mirror reflects nothing but peace. No need to impress anyone, no performance left, just rest. And as your breathing slows, you feel something wonderful, the warm weight of sleep pulling at your shoulders, like a robe worn not for show, but for softness, the kind of sleep you don't earn, but fall into, like stepping backward into a cloud. Let your thoughts go dusty. Let your muscles turn to wax. Let the powdered pages of the past close, one by one, until even your own name sounds like part of a forgotten story. You are safe. You are done. You are finally free to sleep. Sleep now. Sleep well, and when you wake, the powder will be gone. Only dreams will remain.